Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure and honour to be able to talk to John Walker, who was educated a few miles away from where I was educated and brought up in Yorkshire. John, tell me when and where you were born.
I was born in Halifax, Yorkshire, on the 7th of January 1941, so it was during the Second World War. And my father did not actually join in the war. He had a reserved occupation. He worked for Imperial Chemical Industries in Huddersfield, making munitions. But he was, by trade, a stonemason, and he returned to that after the war. I was brought up not in Halifax, but in a small village close to the towns of Elland and Brighouse, at a place called Lower Edge, which was a quarrying community. And my grandfather had been at the centre. He owned the local quarry. He employed about 40 men, and it was really quite a well-developed enterprise. They had steam engines, railroads running around the quarry, pulled by horses, and it really was a very thriving business in the 1920s and 30s. He was reasonably prosperous, and they lived in a house called Quarry House that was built in the 16th century, 17th century, 16th century actually, 16th century, beautiful mullioned windows, and that's where my father and his 2 brothers and 5 sisters were brought up. My grandfather was a local politician. He was a councillor, town councillor in Brighouse for the Conservative Party, which I've taken some stick for since. He died suddenly in the 1930s, I think in his 40s, and for reasons I still don't understand, the business was lost, and my grandmother was left with the house and presumably a certain amount of money on which to bring up her family. But my father and his brothers, who'd been anticipating moving into running the business when their father retired, had to do other things. And what my father did for the rest of his life was actually to be a stonemason.
What is a stonemason? I mean, for Chinese viewers, shall we say?
What he would do is to take really large amorphous pieces of stone and turn them into something recognisable that could be used in buildings. So he'd make the mullions round windows. He did more decorative pieces of stonework, but he also did more mundane stonework, because he could do it rapidly and make quite a lot of money by doing piecework. He was a very hard-working man, actually, and that's what he did for most of his life.
What was his character? I mean,
what was his character? So first of all, he was quite small and wiry, but immensely strong from his job. He was a very outgoing kind of person. He was very popular. He had sung in a group. He had a very fine bass voice, and he and some friends formed a kind of medley group, and they would sing in public. He played the piano, he played it very well, and he also played the church organ. So he was a unusual mixture, at least by today's standards. He was largely uneducated. He'd left school, I think, when he was about 12 or something of that nature. So this was the environment in which I was brought up, with my grandmother still living in this large rambling stone house, and we living in much more modest circumstances across the street, with my mother and father and two sisters, and in the same village other aunts and uncles lived. And so the Walker family dominated this village. We were always at the heart of all the activities, particularly centred around the church. The first organist was my father's aunt, my father's sister, Madge, and when she couldn't play, my father played. When she was playing, he sang in the choir, and so did I. I joined the choir when I was 3 years of age, and had people tell me a rather fine treble voice, and I sang all of the solos that had to be sung at evensong. It was a small church, and the communions were only held once a month, but there was evensong every week, and we always attended. And I think from that I really gained and retained a great love of English church music.
What about your English church religion? Because this is a very, very famous non-conformist area, one of the most famous in Britain.
It is, and my mother was of that ilk, but my family were really strictly, as it were, Church of England, and despite there being many non-conformist churches around, there was a Baptist church quite close by, Methodist churches. We attended the Church of England. I'll come later to
your religion.
to religion.
Okay. Your mother's character.
So my mother was brought up in another village, actually further into the Pennines and closer to Halifax, a place called Ripondon, which is in a valley. One could describe it as a dale. It's a very beautiful village. It's quite a large village now. And her father owned a cotton mill. His name was Ernest Lawton. He also had 8 children. We have this.
Is that Lawton, L-O-R? Or
it's L-A-W-T-O-N.
Yeah.
And I think some of the members of his family came from Lancashire, so we were a family that was on both sides. That side of the family was on both sides of the Pennines. So my mother was the youngest of these 8 children. Again, I think there were 3 boys and 5 girls. And he also died prematurely when my mother was 8 years of age, because some of her elder siblings were already young grown-ups, but she had one brother, Harold, who was I think about a year and a bit older than her. And when her father died, they were packed off to boarding school in Halifax, to Crossley and Porter's School, which is still a very, very well-known school.
What is it called?
Crossley and Porter's School.
Crossley and Porter's.
It's very close to a famous landmark called Wayne House Tower, which is a huge folly that's visible for miles around. And she was there. She was very unhappy, as you can imagine, a 7 or 8-year-old would be, separated from her mother and her family rather suddenly. I think my grandmother did this not from unkindness, but from necessity. She had somehow to bring up the other members of her family, and I think there was some kind of special arrangement for children who'd lost one parent at this Crossley and Porter's School. It was only a matter of 6 or 7 miles from where they lived, but of course transport was rather more difficult in those days. So she continued at Crossley and Porter's School until I think she was about 17, and really had a very good education. And we have pictures of her doing dramatics, doing Isadora Duncan type dancing, and she was, relative to my father, well educated. She spoke French, and she was also a very fine sportswoman and played hockey, I think, for the county, and also lacrosse. She left. She had to leave then. Of course, there was no possibility of her taking her education further, and so she worked for a local company in Ripondon called Ripondon District Motors, they're a haulage firm, and she worked there, and for several years till she met my father, and then eventually they married, and the rest, as they say, is history. So they were rather different in that respect. My mother was very serious, actually, and rather academic in her outlook. She clearly had talents that far exceeded her the education that she'd received and her situation. She was actually very good at maths, and so as often happens in those circumstances, she in particular invested all her ambitions in me, her eldest child. And so I have two younger sisters, Judith. We share the same birthday. She's exactly 2 years younger than I. And Jennifer, who's about 5 years younger than I am. And so my mother spent a lot of time with me as a small child. She taught me to read at a very early age, and showed me particularly arithmetic, again at an early age. She wasn't especially interested in science. She was more interested in books, and then I got a love of music from my father. My father was more interested in the natural world. One of the things he would do was look at the stars, and he was very familiar with the constellations. The best we could do, of course, were binoculars, but I did get that from him. And then they had friends close by, the Woods. They were a family of butchers, and there were two unmarried daughters. Neither of them ever married, and the younger one, in particular, Helen, was very knowledgeable about botany, and she showed me again the flowers and trees, and I could name them quite extensively at an early age. And so I think my interest in the natural world really stems from the contacts with Helen Wood, and from my father's interests, and then I went to the local schools, which was attached to the church. It was a Church of England school with one class in it, with children ranging from ages from 3 till 7 or 8, run by the teacher was a lady called Miss Shuttleworth, an extraordinary woman. I can see her now, and she somehow managed this class that probably no more than 12, 15 children with this range of ages, and she, I think, was also very helpful in getting me to quite a high standard, really quite rapidly, at least as well as she could in those circumstances. And then when I was, I think it was when I was 8 or 9, something like that, I moved to a larger school, which seemed a long way away. It was actually 2 miles away, actually in Rastrick, a place called Cargreen School, and there I was put into the B stream, which were the not so bright children, because it was assumed I came from this rather rural school that I must therefore be not very bright. But within weeks they sort of discovered me and moved me into the A stream. I moved immediately to the top of the class and remained there throughout that junior school period. I was challenged quite a lot by 3 very able girls, and we had quite a competition, which I can still remember. I became head boy even of the junior school. I would make speeches. I was really quite self-confident at that age. I was also developing into a keen sportsman. I played soccer a lot. Rugby union just wasn't on the map for us. Of course, there was a rugby league going on around us, but we didn't play that. We played soccer in winter, and then around Easter time we put our football boots away, took out the cricket stumps, and then we played cricket all summer. So those were my 2 main sports. I was very, very keen on both of them, and remained so, particularly with cricket. so the seeds of the love of those sports started very early on. Didn't come from my father. He had no interest at all in ball sports. He was interested in horse racing, but not in ball sports. I think to summarise this early part of my life, it really was a very happy childhood, surrounded by supportive and loving extended family. I've not mentioned my mother's sibling. I lived a bit further away, but they also were extremely caring, particularly my grandmother. So then, of course, like everyone else, at the age of 11, I took the 11 plus and then moved on to Rastrick Grammar School, which again was only a couple of miles really from where we lived. We were still living at Lower Edge, and I moved there. It was a single stream grammar school, about 160 boys, not much of a sixth form when I went there, but some extremely able teachers. Several of them had actually been in the RAF in the Second World War and had lots of stories of daring do to tell us about. This, of course, was the sort of early 1950s, and I thrived in that environment, with one exception. I was top of the class throughout the whole period that I was there. I slipped one term and moved down to fourth. I mean, of course, I was as it were, a relatively big fish in a small pool, and that was something I had to learn about later when I moved to Oxford. Again, I seemed to do equally well in arts and science subjects. I was actually quite interested in French. That was the only modern language we were taught to any level. We, of course, were taught classics. We had a choice between Latin or woodwork. I chose Latin. Or chemistry or art. I chose chemistry, of course. We were given a lot of freedom in that school, and I remember doing experiments in the laboratory in my sort of mid-teens in the chemistry laboratory unsupervised. I would take a book, and I remember on one occasion I made phosgene because I thought it would be nice to see these rings that were depicted in the chemistry textbook, something that would horrify a chemistry teacher today. Then, of course, eventually I took the O-levels, again, did pretty well at that, passing in 9 subjects, and I was torn to what I should do. I didn't really know whether I should move into the arts stream or the science stream, and actually I got very little advice, and this was, of course, was beyond the experience and ken of my family, so I got very little career advice. Nobody was steering me in a particular direction. In fact, the only careers that my family seemed to think was I could aspire to was to become a school teacher or to become a parson, and they thought that both of those were within my ambit. Nobody ever suggested that there were careers like the law or medicine. They was just simply beyond their experience that somebody from their family would even aspire to something, to those professions. I had a number of teachers who took an interest in me and encouraged me, but there was one very enthusiastic chemistry teacher who was not much different from us in age. He was in his early 20s, he was in his first job, and so of course I was drawn to him. And he had a brother who'd just gone up to Oxford to read chemistry. They were both local boys, gone to local grammar school in Elland, which is the next town. And so eventually I decided that I'd do science.
Do you remember his name?
Yes, Maurice Walshaw. His brother was Keith. And in fact, I met Maurice, I think it was in 1999, at the University of Huddersfield. gave me an honorary degree, and they asked me, was there anybody particularly I'd like to invite along? And so I suggested Morris, and they found him, and he came along. He was rather overawed by the whole thing, and I'm not sure he was very happy in the environment in which he found himself, but it was very, very nice to meet him again. But he was very helpful, and he gave me special tuition, got me to write extra examinations, and did the best that he could to prepare me for entrance examinations for Oxford and Cambridge, because this was really beyond the experience of any of the teachers at the school. So somehow during this period I decided I was going to go to Oxford. It seemed to be Oxford rather than Cambridge. And the other teachers couldn't understand this. They just could not understand my aspirations and wanted to know, why didn't I just go to Leeds or Manchester, where most of their most able pupils went. And I think they thought this was some kind of pretentious aspiration that I had. But Morris encouraged me and helped me and advised.
Why do you think you did think of Oxford? I mean,
pardon?
Was it because of his brother, or do you think there was some other reason why you thought of Oxford?
I don't know what was the background of their parents actually, and I imagine that some of it came from people within the Walshaw family. So Morris himself had.
But your interest, why did you want to go to Oxford?
Why did I want to? Because I thought it was the best place. I mean, by that stage I'd begun to know I'd begun to know names in science and somehow associated some of those names with Oxford, but why it should have been Oxford and not London or Cambridge, I really don't know. I think that actually there is another reason. So I'm going to contradict myself slightly, but one of the influences it's certainly in my mid-teens, I can't remember the precise date, I'd become interested in cosmology, and I'd read a lot of books by Eddington and Jeans on cosmology. And then I latched onto Fred Hoyle as somebody who'd come from the West Riding of Yorkshire. I think he went to Bingley Grammar School, and then of course he was here in Cambridge, and his story is well known, and no doubt Martin Rees talked a bit about, or may have talked about Fred Hoyle. But he was somebody who was a public figure, and there was a program on television. So television had pretty much, well, it began really with the coronation in 1953. That was the first time that I ever saw television, actually, I think. And there was one in the village where we lived, and we all went to watch the coronation. And then I remember watching a lot of cricket. The people who had this television were very kind, and I was allowed to go and watch cricket there. And there was a program called the Brains Trust, and I was fascinated by this. So there was Bertrand Russell, A.J. Eyre, Jacob Bronowski, of course, Alan Bullock, and Fred Hoyle. And they would sit around and talk about topics, all kinds of topics, in a way that I'd never experienced. I thought this was really stunning and splendid in many ways. And so the two people who impressed me were Bullock and Fred Hoyle, whom I knew quite a lot about already because I'd read a number of his books. And so in a way Hoyle was a kind of inspiration to me, but of course he was here in Cambridge.
Yes,
and I went to Oxford.
So was Eddington.
and so was Eddington. That's correct.
But
yeah.
Bullock was at Oxford.
So yes, and so Bullock had been at Bradford Grammar School, which again was a sort of well-known West Riding school, one of the most famous ones, and he was censor, as it was called, of St Catherine's Society in Oxford, and he made a real effort to. He knew that he was going to create St Catherine's College, and I think he was appointed to that position with the view in mind of turning it from a non-collegiate body into a fully fledged college. And so he started recruiting from Northern grammar schools, and so it was that finally sealed it. And actually Keith Walshaw was at St Catherine's Society, and so I ended up applying there and getting admitted to St Cat's, and of course I met Bullock and got to know him a little bit, and again I admired him hugely.
Do you know his son, Nick? Who's
Well,
at college?
I have met him, of course, in Cambridge. I won't say that I know him well, but
I went to school with him. So.
did you? Right. Yeah. So that's really partly why I ended up where I ended up. It's not a fully joined up story, but
Did you get a scholarship or?
no, I didn't. I got admitted as a commoner.
Mm.
I had a state scholarship. And,
Yeah. To read chemistry.
to read chemistry, yes, and so I went up in 1960.
Was it a shock, Oxford in 1960?
You bet.
Because I went up to Oxford in 1962, so I have interesting to compare notes.
Yeah, certainly from rather different backgrounds. So, I mean, again, running alongside my academic achievements at school were sporting achievements. I was captain of cricket and soccer, and I was also involved in field athletics, particularly in throwing the discus. I broke the school record at the time, and all of that. So so I was one of these people that liked doing academic things, but also doing a lot of outdoor things. I was in the Boy Scouts and went rock climbing and caving and did all of that sort of stuff with great gusto, and loved it actually. So I went up in 1960, and it was a real culture shock actually, and it took me a long time to find my feet because I felt completely at sea. I'd never. So in Oxford, of course, I encountered all these very self-confident people whom I'd never encountered before, and I was certainly intimidated by that for quite a long time. It had, I think, quite a negative effect upon me until eventually, of course, one finds one's place. I think as an undergraduate I was pretty unhappy.
Were you?
Yes, and I began to fall out of love with chemistry, partly because of the way it was taught, but partly because of the realization that actually what I really wanted to be doing was something that was more biological. And so I sort of eventually specialised in organic chemistry, did a part 2 in organic synthesis, and then when I say I was unhappy, I mean I wasn't pathologically unhappy, and again I developed a wide circle of friends in college, many of them non-scientists, partly through sport, because I again played for the college first 11 at soccer, and played cricket for them, and played hockey, and actually started to play rugby union. So I had plenty of contacts, and actually I became president of the junior common room at one stage. So I mean, I wasn't sort of living in misery in a corner somewhere, but it was I think in retrospect a very difficult period when I would have benefited from more insight and advice from an older person. There was somebody really missing from my life to help and advise me, and it was quite painful actually.
Were there any teachers? You said the chemistry wasn't gripping you much, but were there any lecturers or lectures that you remember as?
Oh, there were people that I admired enormously. I mean, the first lecture we ever went to was given by Sir Cyril Hinshelwood, and I remember being enormously impressed, thinking, my God, I've really arrived somewhere important to be lectured to by a Nobel laureate on the first down in Oxford. But in terms of lecturers that I remember, I particularly remember Jeremy Knowles, who eventually rose to a high position at Harvard, where he is now.
Is that KN? No.
KN, yes. Yeah. So he was a chemist who took an interest in biological issues, particularly in enzyme kinetics. He didn't teach me, but I remember going to his lectures. So he was one. And I think one of the things that irritated me, we did a lot of natural product chemistry, but it was never linked to biological processes. So we learned a lot about purines and pyrimidines, but actually nobody ever told us about RNA and DNA. And I found that, in retrospect, extraordinary. Of course, I found out about that for myself.
Mm.
Then, around this stage, actually, I got married when I was 21. So I'd met my wife through people I knew at Oxford who came from Bradford. So she lived close to Bradford in a place called Thornton, where her father was the vicar. Thornton, people are always surprised when I say this, but actually Thornton is where the Brontes came from. So Patrick Bronte had been the incumbent at the same church where my future father-in-law was the vicar, and the sisters were actually born in Thornton, not in Howarth.
Mm.
Howarth is about 4 or 5 miles sort of further up into the hills, but Thornton is really where they were children. And so anyway, my wife was studying textile chemistry at Bradford Polytechnic, as it was then, working for a Swiss chemical company, Sando, and then we married. And then she came to Oxford.
At that time, it was rather unusual and indeed frowned on to get married when you were an undergraduate.
It was indeed. And my mother was also extremely unhappy about it. Felt I was making a colossal mistake. Well, we're still married, so
It worked.
And there we are. So my wife came to Oxford, and then she found a job as a technician in the Department of Pharmacology, and seemed to fit in very well there. And we got to know people through that. And one of the people she got to know was Edward Abraham.
Mm.
And one day he mentioned to her that he was looking for a PhD student, and so I ended up going to talk to him.
What was his background? I don't know.
So Edward was in the Department of Pathology, the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology in Oxford. He was a chemist by training. He'd worked, I once said this, I understand you worked with Sir Robert Robinson. Sir Robert Robinson being the greatest organic chemist probably of the early part of the 20th century, frowned and said, I wouldn't say I worked with him, meaning that he saw very little of Robinson, because Robinson, again Edward told me this, Robinson once was criticised for hardly ever being in Oxford. He was always consulting for this company and that company. He said, well, if they pay me 1/5 of what I'm worth, I'll spend 1/5 of my time in Oxford. So he was a chemist that worked on chemistry of peptides, and actually whilst, as it were, working with Robinson, he crystallised lysozyme from hen eggs, which was the first time that lysozyme had ever been crystallised, a very famous protein that served as a model in enzymology. So that would be the sort of 1936, at that kind of 7, that he did that. And about that time, Florey and Chain were together in the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology discussing a research program on chemical compounds that might kill bacteria. Many such have been described in the literature, even into the 19th century. And they drew up a list of about a dozen such principles, as there were. And one of those was lysozyme, because Fleming had actually described making little boys weep and collecting their tears to get lysozyme, and showed that they had antibacterial properties alongside the work that he did on penicillin. Of course, penicillin was one of them. So Edward joined them and was part of the penicillin team, and his work was mainly on determining the chemical structure of penicillin during the war, for which Chain was given the Nobel Prize after the war with Florey and Fleming, and clearly there's some resentment on Edward's part about this. At least I think I detected that. so he had that background, and the penicillins consist of two fused ring structures, one of them called beta-lactam ring. Edward proposed this based on his chemical experiments, and all the other chemists in Oxford said that he was talking drivel, amongst them Robinson and a man called John Cornforth, who went on to win a Nobel Prize later, and others. They all said the same thing. Cornforth, who was profoundly deaf actually, and has been most of his life, said to Edward, if that's correct, Abraham, I'll eat my hat. And of course, this is a well-known story, but Dorothy Hodgkin then looked at penicillin using X-ray diffraction and showed that indeed Edward's proposal was correct, and whereupon Cornforth gamely turned up at Edward's office with his hat on a tray and said, how am I supposed to do this, Edward? So that's where he was, and then after the war, he stayed there. Florey himself became interested in other subjects in blood clotting, but Edward continued to work on penicillins, trying to understand their biosynthetic origin, and because of their past work, people with interests in mycology and in antibiotics would come all the time. So the most significant one was a man called Mayor Brotsu, came from a town in I think it was in Sardinia, and he discovered a fungus that produced something that seemed like a penicillin, which it turned out to be. But Edward discovered through his persistence and diligence that it was producing small amounts of another antibiotic which actually killed off penicillin-resistant microorganisms, because they emerged from the very beginning. In fact, they were probably there already. The penicillin resistance was already there. And they, of course, became commercially extremely, the cephalosporins, as they were called, became commercially extremely important, and Edward became immensely wealthy from that, and gave a great proportion of his wealth back to Oxford University and Lincoln College, where he was a fellow. So it was pretty much at that time that cephalosporins were beginning to be commercialized that I was there working with Edward. It was a very small group of people. He was a very modest, very self-effacing man, but he'd seen what had happened with penicillins during the war, where there was no financial benefit, came to Britain. All of the patents were held in the United States, and that happened more or less from necessity. The story's well known. But he told me, I'm determined that this won't happen with the cephalosporins, and that Oxford will benefit from it, and that clearly was part of his mission from the very beginning, and he was successful. So I worked on other antibiotics that had been studied actually as part of this larger study that Florey and Shane started in 1938 or whenever it was, and I worked on an antibiotic produced by Bacillus subtilis when it sporulated, and eventually I worked out its chemical structure.
This was part of your PhD, was it?
That was my DPhil.
DPhil,
that's right.
Yes.
This was a very important period for me, because it developed. It was the period in which I moved really from chemistry into much more biological topics. In the Sir William Dunn School, as you can imagine, there were people from different backgrounds, because there were biochemists, molecular biologists, virologists, people working on aspects of different pathologies. And Edward thought it was important that I should get a proper grasp of subjects like bacterial genetics, of understanding microorganisms both in a practical sense and knowing about their classification and so forth. And so effectively I with him did another course that that taught me all of these things, and he gave me time and space to learn them, and actually pointed me in the right direction. During this period, a man called David Phillips became the first professor, effectively, of molecular biology, of structural biology in Oxford. The chair is now called the David Phillips Chair. And so he was a direct successor of Dorothy Hodgkin.
Did you know Dorothy Hodgkin?
I met her, but only casually. She once dropped a book on me, actually, in the science library, which I picked up for her and put it back on the shelf. And no, I can't say that I knew her.
She was an amazing lady.
She was, yes. So David had been at the Royal Institution and came to Oxford, and really started this whole discipline of structural biology. And he did something extraordinary. He gave a series of lectures for graduate students, and that had never happened before in sciences. They were riveting, and he described his work on lysozyme, and I can still remember those lectures very clearly. They made a big impression on me and made me think, this is the sort of thing I'm really interested in. And at the same time, another influence came via a television program. It was a series of lectures given by John Kendrew. It was called The Thread of Life.
Another Cambridge
person, and John, of course, had got the Nobel Prize in 1963 with Max Perutz. And in consequence of that, he gave this series of lectures on the BBC television, and they were wonderful. He explained about myoglobin and hemoglobin, but also about DNA and the structure of DNA. And I think those two things made me think, well, okay, that's really what I want to be doing. And then with the input that I got from Edward, which would give me the academic knowledge and awareness, I began to feel that's pretty much what I wanted to do. So I then, eventually got my DPhil. I went off to Madison, Wisconsin for a couple of years, and that was an important period for a number of reasons. Firstly, I'd lived this rather cloistered life in Oxford by this time for 7 or 8 years, or 9 years even, and suddenly went to America and found myself in the middle of huge political storms, the likes of which, of course, I'd sort of read about them a bit.
This is the Vietnam period.
They were to do with the Vietnam War. There were other issues as well, which were to do with race. There were race riots going on as well. And I remember arriving in Madison, Wisconsin, and finding the Capitol building surrounded by troops with bayonets drawn. I thought, my God, what have I come to? And then, I can't remember the precise date, but I think it was after I'd been there a few months, Nixon bombed Cambodia, and the whole place erupted, and the students rioted, burnt cars, ran around. And
you had your family, presumably, as well, did you?
we didn't have children at that stage, no.
But your wife was there?
My wife was there.
Yeah.
I'd never seen anything like it in my life. We got tear gassed in the laboratory, and this went on throughout most of that period. It was really a very tumultuous period in the United States because there was so much dissension linked to the Vietnam War, and of course university students felt this particularly because of the draft. And they were. I met people who were graduate students who had actually served in Vietnam and were clearly scarred and damaged by it. I got to know one of them quite well, and so that was one part was sort of getting in direct contact with big political issues, and it was actually quite difficult not to sort of join in, because you, as it were, start running around with them because you felt so sympathetic to, or at least I felt so sympathetic to their cause, but I didn't. But the other thing was to go to this very big Midwestern school, which actually had very high standards, extremely good courses in graduate school. And I think I'd gone there thinking there wasn't a great deal more for me to learn, but I quickly realised it was just complete nonsense. And so I then started sitting in on courses at the University of Wisconsin, given by really very well-known people in the field of enzymology, and that sort of, as it were, finished off, or not finished off, but added another dimension to my education. So when I was there, I was wondering what to do next, and I had the opportunity to stay both in Madison, but also to join the pharmaceutical industry. I went to Eli Lilly in Indianapolis in February and thought that there's no way I'm going to spend more than a few hours of my life in this place. So I left Indianapolis without really considering what they were offering me. And I'd already contacted people in France because I'd become interested in using a technique called mass spectrometry to examine proteins and peptides. Well, so I was a graduate student at Oxford, and with help of people there, I'd recorded spectra of peptides that were helpful in determining the structure of bacillicin. And then I realised that the best laboratory in the world at that time, 1971, was actually in France, in Givres-sur-Yvette. And so I made a point of meeting the head of this laboratory at a conference in the United States.
How do you spell Givres-sur-Yvette?
It is G-I-F, and then Sur, S-U-R, Yvette,
Yeah.
Y-V-E-T-T-E, is just outside Paris. Southwest of Paris, quite close to Versailles. And so his name was Edgar Lederer, and so I joined his lab. I got a NATO fellowship and went there to work with him. I started using these techniques. And whilst I was there, I quickly met a Czech protein chemist who moved from Czechoslovakia, called Borivoj Keil, K-E-I-L, known as Boya. And he had been in contact with Jacques Monod at the Pasteur Institute. So Monod somewhat reluctantly decided that the Pasteur needed to understand the structure of proteins better, and had asked Keil to go there to form a new department of chimie des protéines, protein chemistry. And so Keil asked me if I'd go there. By that stage I got a fellowship from European Molecular Biology Organisation, EMBO, and so I moved there with him and helped him to set up this new department, and my wife was there as well. And we put a huge amount of effort into organising this place, organising retraining staff. And the Pasteur were dangling a position in front of me. I could become Pasteurien. And so we seriously thought about staying in France for a long period of time, and were mentally adjusted to that notion. Then Keil started to get nasty with me. People explained later that didn't I understand that I was outshining him, and he didn't like it. And there were some really extremely unpleasant incidents with him of a personal nature. My mother died during this period, and in front of other people he criticised me publicly for having left the laboratory at short notice to go back to England. I thought this was so outrageous. I still haven't really forgiven him.
Is he still alive, and will he mind?
No, he's not. No.
Oh, okay. No. It's all right to.
I think his wife, his second wife, is, and certainly his child. But
and this is all right for public consumption.
I think so. Yes, I don't think I mind people knowing about that. And so I decided that I really couldn't stay there. I've met some really very nice, very helpful, highly intelligent, sophisticated people at the Pasteur. I've even managed to speak to Jacques Monod.
Yes, what was he like?
He was very aloof. I mean, he was director of the Institute. I mean, clearly an extremely interesting man. But the Institute was in dire financial predicament, and Monod was in the position of having to resolve this. Otherwise, the Pasteur Institute was in danger of collapse. And so it seemed to me that the whole of his period of his direction was dominated by such matters. But I mean, he was very theatrical. He called everybody together once and said, he started out by saying, "Notre institut est pourri," our institute is rotten. And what he meant was it was falling down, and it was. A lot of the buildings were falling apart. I remember people being shocked by this. And then he explained his plan, which was to sell off the Pasteur. It was in the 15th arrondissement. It occupied a very valuable site, and so his idea was to realize the value of the site by selling it off, then moving the institute to the Côte d'Azur. And at this point, his deputy director, a man called Elie Volman, said, "But Jacques, you're forgetting Monsieur Pasteur, he's buried here." and Monod said, "Well, Elie, you can stay here to take care of Pasteur. We're off to the Côte d'Azur."
He was buried in the basement, you were saying. It was a mausoleum.
That's right. Yeah. And so, anyway, of course, none of that happened, and Monod did find another solution. It turned out that the Pasteur were providing free all kinds of services for the health system in France, and I think one of at least part of the solution was that Monod persuaded the government to pay for that. I mean, clearly they couldn't allow the Pasteur to collapse. It had been created really from the love and regard of the French nation for Pasteur and admiration of him, and was provided by public subscription. It would have been a scandal if it had collapsed. And parts of it may have been rotten, but actually parts of it were extremely good, and some good people there. And one of them, a man called Georges Cohen, and I became quite close to each other. I worked with Georges and did experiments with him. I found him extremely interesting. He had interesting people around him, and so when things began to get a bit unpleasant, he could see that perhaps my solution was back in England, and so he helped me to come back to England. Again, fortune favoured me, because I came here to Cambridge Easter 1974 to a course given or funded by this body EMBO, European Molecular Biology Organisation, and held partly in St John's and partly in the Department of Biochemistry, and it was organised by Richard Perham, who was the master of St John's, and a man called Ian Harris, who was a fellow of Darwin, and
Ian,
yes. So Richard was in the Department of Biochemistry, and Ian was at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology. So really, and again, it was on the structure of proteins, the chemical analysis of proteins, and I found it extremely stimulating meeting. It was exactly right for me. And at the dinner, I was sitting next to some, which was held in Trinity, I think. I think it was held in Trinity, not St John's. It could have been in St John's. I'm not absolutely sure. It must have been in St John's. Must have been. And there was a funny speech actually somebody made about this sort of rivalry between John's and Trinity, which I'm not aware of. And the person asked me who I was and what did I do, and then he said, "I'm Fred Sanger." And I just blurted out without thinking, "I thought you were dead." and so he said, he didn't get angry. He said, he actually says he doesn't remember this, but I do. And he said, "Why?" And why did I think that? And so I said, well, I was scrambling, of course, at this stage, covered in confusion. And so I said, well, in my final honours paper at Oxford, I had to answer, or I answered a question which was, describe the contributions of Greenyard, Perkin and Sanger, all of whom have reagents named after them. And I said I knew that both Perkin and Greenyard were long into history, so I assumed you were as well. And he found that acceptable. So anyway, at the end of this conversation, he said, "Have you ever thought of coming back to England?" And I thought, well, I have now. And I went off to Wales on holiday with a very good friend, Tim Brighouse, who's a historian I knew from Oxford, who became a well-known educationalist. Tim was best man when I got married. We spent a lot of holidays together in Wales with our families. And I told him about this, and he said, "Look, Walker, get on the phone to this Sanger person and ask if you can come and see him on your way back to Paris." So I did, rather with some trepidation. So I went to see Fred at Laboratory of Molecular Biology out at the Addenbrooks, and I asked if I could come there. And he said, "Well, we don't have any space, and I don't have any money, but if you want to come, you can come, providing you can support yourself." So I had the fellowship from EMBO, so with George Cohen's help, we transferred the fellowship to Cambridge, and EMBO were very helpful with that. There was 3 months funding to go, and so I came for 3 months, and I thought it was worth it because it would get me back to Britain, and I'd be in a famous place, and that had to be good for me. And after I'd been there a little time, Fred said, "Well, you seem like quite a reasonable chap, Walker. Why don't you stay another 6 months? I'll find the money." And it went on like that until he said, I think you should stay much longer."
How was he doing this? Because he wasn't head of the MRC or anything.
He was head of a division, so his division was called Protein and Nucleic Acid Chemistry, which describes his activities. And Ian Harris was in that division, as was Brian Hartley.
Perutz was head of the MRC.
So Perutz was chairman of the laboratory. Now when the laboratory was set up, when Perutz was setting up the laboratory, of course its origins in the Cavendish are well known, Fred was the only one with a Nobel Prize, and so although Francis and Sidney were clearly important, and
Bremer and
were
Francis
clearly important parts of it, Fred was the only one with a Nobel Prize, and so this is what I've been told, sort of negotiated a special position for himself where he had independent access to the head office, the Medical Research Council, independent of Max Perutz. And so that gave him a kind of privileged position. I don't think he used it. But I mean, Max ran the laboratory he was chairman of a group of scientists. He wasn't the director, he was the chairman of a board that consisted of Francis Crick Sidney, Fred, Hugh Huxley, and Aaron.
Aaron Klug.
Aaron Klug, yes.
What was Perutz like?
Well, Richard Perham once described him to me as the iron fist in a velvet glove. So, I mean, Max was extremely nice person. I think I got on with him very well, but it was clear that he could make difficult decisions. So that's what Richard was referring to. That he could be ruthless with some people, and if he didn't think they were quite good enough, then he would take steps to move them aside and get rid of them. I found him, I think as most people did, a very inspiring person. I've talked to him frequently, often had lunch with him. I learned rapidly that you could not have any conversation that was remotely trivial with Max. You couldn't discuss politics, you couldn't discuss sport, anything personal. That doesn't mean to say he wasn't interested in you as a person. He wanted to talk about science all the time. But I quickly realized that he wanted to talk about the history of science, and I found that a rich seam, actually, that I could plug into and learn about who did what, and I found that extremely interesting. I mean, one would get other insights into his personality. I mean, he would do things that were extremely kind. In a very unassuming and hidden kind of way. There's no public display, and once, as it were, he had confidence in you. He gave you his full confidence and supported you, and so he was one of the people that encouraged me through the project that eventually led to the
I remember Aaron Klug told a nice story. He said that several times he used to go and tell Max what he was doing, and Max had said, "Oh yes, that's interesting, keep it up." And it was only much later that he realised that Max thought it was completely mad. There was no chance of it succeeding, but he just gave him his confidence, and
right
illustrates what you're saying.
Yes, he if he thought you were good enough, then he would back you, and Fred was the same. So the project that us eventually started, which was that led to the Nobel Prize, it came directly from Fred's interest in mitochondrial DNA, which he used really as a means to expand the technical possibilities of DNA sequencing. It was 3 times bigger than Phi-X174, and that really was his interest in it. He wasn't interested in the biology of mitochondria and all the proteins and what it all did. That was for other people to pick up and run with, and that's what I did. I got interested in what was going on and the machine, what turned out to be molecular machines that were involved, and I realized that it was actually a pretty virgin field. It was clearly a very important area, but there's nothing really. Very few people really trying to understand in great detail the fundamental science that lay behind it. So I arrived at the LMB, Laboratory of Molecular Biology, shortly after Easter in 1974, and quickly became acquainted with and in contact with an extraordinary group of people. Francis Crick, Sidney Brenner, Hugh Huxley, Fred, of course, and Max Barutz, and Aaron Klug. But the ones who shone publicly were Francis and Sidney. They dominated all discussions at seminars. They dominated the questions, and indeed Francis would rephrase questions that people put, because he thought that he understood the question, what the person was trying to get at, better than the question themselves. And actually he once did that to me. I even remember the question that I was asking, because it impressed me so much that anybody would do this.
Did he rephrase it better than you'd?
Well, no, I don't think so. I thought it was particularly clear and succinct. It still do. It actually related to the number of ATP molecules that were consumed in packaging DNA into a viral head. It turns out I end up working on the homologue of the molecular motor that does this. So it's something that's come back into my life in the last 15 years. But I was asking this question in 1974 or 5 when Francis was still there. He left, of course, soon after, and went off to the Salk Institute and severed his formal links to the Laboratory of Molecular Biology.
And as a thinker, I was very impressed in my interview of Aaron as a very brilliant mind.
He did. He is a brilliant thinker. He has been a brilliant thinker, and he has a very wide knowledge. I learnt quite a lot from Aaron in the 1990s. He got interested in in Alzheimer's disease, and put together a group of people at the LMB to look at bodies that are found associated with people with Alzheimer's, who died from Alzheimer's disease, called tangles. These are tangles of proteins. It wasn't known what they were made of, and it seemed that there was an association with the presence of tangles in Alzheimer's brains and their formation, and so in order to try and understand the origins of the disease, understanding the origins of the tangles seemed to be important, so you had to know what they were. And so he put together a team which involved Cesar Milstein, myself, and then a medical person called Claude Vischik, who had access to the material. I was doing the chemical analysis, Cesar was doing immunochemical analysis, and Michel Godet was also part of it. And Aaron managed this group of people, and he had a particular managerial style, actually, which I'd never encountered before, that I found really quite interesting. The way that he took people who were really quite senior. I mean, Cesar was already a Nobel laureate, but he managed that group of people on this particular topic, and it was quite effective. And we also did this in our spare time, as it were. But Aaron kept us together, and we achieved something together that was quite important. It was published in 3 papers in the PNAS. So I learned something about managing groups of scientists from that experience.
What about Cesar Milstein, who you've mentioned?
Well, I knew Cesar very well because he was in the next laboratory to me. So he was in the division of protein nucleic acid chemistry, and he wasn't Fred's PhD student, as some people have written. That's incorrect, actually. He worked for a man called Malcolm Dixon. But it was Fred who encouraged him to come back. He left Cambridge and went back to Argentina after his PhD, and it was Fred who encouraged him to come back and to work on immunological topics, which is what he did in the Department of Biochemistry, and then moved down to I think he'd gone back to Argentina again, but then he came to the NMB and worked in Fred's division. Cesar, a delightful person who had a really quite illogical mind, seemingly illogical mind, and this infuriated Sidney. Sidney was a very logical thinker, of course very rapid, but it was all based on facts, and well, of course Sidney made jumps, but Cesar somehow would make wild jumps that often turn out to be correct, and he wasn't very good at explaining where he was coming from, or where he was going, but experimentally he was just somehow extremely good and extremely effective. He was very knowledgeable. He knew all about his own field. I liked him a lot as a person and a scientist, but again I came into conflict with him through him being Fred's successor, head of division, because Cesar wanted to focus the whole division on immunology, and yet that's not what I did, and I managed to persuade Cesar not to change the name of the division to Division of Immunology, and that it should remain as it does to this day, protein nucleic acid chemistry, so that it's a broad church and can incorporate all kinds of different people, and I think that was the right thing to do. He wasn't very supportive of me through difficult times, whereas Max in particular was. Fred had gone. I mean, when I went to Fred to tell him what I wanted to do, he just listened very patiently and said, "Well, why don't you get on with it?" Which was, that was the equivalent to writing a grant for several people for 20 years. But he did support me, and once it became clear that I was going to be successful, Cesar became extremely interested in me, actually, and was very happy about my success, although I still feel that he didn't really help me by helping to engender that success in a very positive kind of way. I don't wish at all to be unkind to Cesar, because he was such a pleasant and nice person.
Just, I'd like to come to your success in a moment, but just two last people who I've interviewed, two other chemists, Kingsman, who you mentioned. One was Hal Dixon.
Yeah.
Did you know Hal well? You said you met him in 1974.
I wouldn't say that I knew Hal well. I met him during the December course in 1974. This was the first time I met him, and was interested in his very deep knowledge actually of chemistry of proteins. I think I benefited from that. But my contacts with Hal really were very few, and over the years we never did anything together. I just meet him very occasionally.
What about Dan Brown?
Dan different. I mean, Dan retired, took early retirement from the chemistry department, and then came to the laboratory of molecular biology as a retired worker. And so I used to talk to Dan quite often. We once nearly did something together, but we didn't quite. It required the synthesis of an unusual nucleotide. But I think what happened was I managed to solve the problem by a different route. We did some experiments together, but I liked talking to Dan, and I found he had an interesting view on the world, and he I think I mentioned earlier he had insights into how the structure of DNA was worked out by Francis Crick and Jim Watson. He also would say quite interesting things about Lord Todd.
Really?
Well, he'd worked with Alexander Todd, and he could be quite critical, I think, at times.
I missed that on his interview, but he did talk a lot about RNA in his interview, and his work on that seemed to be rather important.
That I'm not so familiar with Dan's contributions in that area. That was long before I came. I mean, I'm aware of work on RNA that went on in the Maltino Institute from Roy Markham and John Smith, with whom Dan interacted with, both of them. I know in general terms what they did. It was to work out methods of separating oligonucleotides by chromatography, and I think probably Dan's contribution was how to break down the RNA in a controlled way, but I'm not certain about that.
One last point. When I interviewed Aaron Klug, he was very keen to talk about zinc fingers. Seemed to think a lot was potentially there in the future with zinc fingers. You must have come across these.
Well, I remember their discovery by a student of Aaron's. Didn't discover them, but he isolated the material from frogs, from Xenopus frogs. There was this huge slaughter everywhere. This guy went from which he got material from which he isolated the protein in which the zinc finger was identified. I think it was Aaron certainly put the picture together of what was going on, and its importance as an element in many transcription factors. Aaron used to claim that the zinc finger was the most abundant motif in the protein world, but I'm afraid he's wrong, because the most abundant motif is called the Walker motif.
Is it?
That I discovered. I once said this to Aaron, and he said, "Are you sure you're right about this?" But I've actually been collaborating with some bioinformaticists who confirmed that it is indeed true. So this is a motif that's associated with binding nucleotides, with purine nucleotides, ATP and so forth.
Well, tell us, that's an obvious lead in to the end of the story about how you got your Nobel Prize.
Yeah, so I'd started to talk about Peter Mitchell and how the bioenergetics field was dominated by him and his concepts of chemiosmosis, which have been very difficult to get established. And even after his 1978 Nobel Prize, there were many people who still thought that it wasn't correct, that the proton motive force, as Mitchell called it, was not. Well, Mitchell's view, which is correct, is that it's an intermediate in energy conversion. But there were people who disputed that. And so through the period that I entered this field, it was still dominated by debates on chemiosmosis and particularly on how proton pumps work, but without any discussion or experimentation to really understand the fundamentals of the pumps themselves. That came later. And Mitchell sort of was very insistent on experiments being done when what he did was he hung on to ideas too long, and this forced other people to keep on doing experiments that they might not have done, and which probably were not very, very profitable. So his general concepts were correct, but some of the details that he'd said over the years turned out not to be precise, and that was true of the ATPAs that I worked on. So I got on with the ATPAs from the early 1980s, and there have been some very good biochemistry done, but none of the proteins have been characterized properly, and so I set about sequencing them using old-fashioned, by current standards, protein chemical methods. Then I quickly latched on to using recombinant DNA. Actually, Sydney helped me there and provided me with material that was extremely helpful. It's one of the good interactions that I had with Sydney. Fred didn't want me to use DNA. He thought, I've employed you as a protein chemist, and you shall study proteins and not nucleic acids, and he wanted me to develop methods with proteins, and I disagreed with him, but he let me get on. I said, well, I was going to use them anyway. He said, you'd probably get beaten. Knowing perfectly well that this would spur me on to even greater efforts. So Fred was pretty good at psychology, I think. Yeah. And so I worked on establishing the chemical composition of the enzyme, number of proteins in it, discovered many components that were unknown, reconstituted parts of it. But my aim was always to get a high resolution structure, and so from the very beginning I was trying to grow crystals of, at the time, what people thought was a very large protein complex, and many people thought it was impossible. And I was variously advised that I was wrecking my career, and why didn't I do something easier, and it just preposterously difficult, and so on and so forth. But this is exactly, I think, what appealed to people like Max, was that I would be prepared to take on something like that, and seemed to be making progress, and so they backed me. And
were there moments when you despaired? Or?
Never. No, never. Because we were incrementally making progress the whole time, and I was in a community of people actually who didn't think this was unusual to struggle with a problem for a long time, as long as it was an important problem and people could see that it was, and I seemed to be doing things apparently in an appropriate way.
When you say a long time, how long a time?
Well, I think I started trying to grow crystals in 1982 or 3, and by the time they were any good was 10 years later. And I kept at it the whole time with a particular postdoc, René Lutter, from
How do you spell it?
Lutter. And with a research assistant, Michael Brunswick, we kept going the whole time, and we had crystals from the very beginning, but they didn't diffract very well, and I didn't know much about growing crystals, let alone how to diffract them, and eventually we sort of learnt these skills. So I've always said that that it's very important to have an important biological topic and then problem, and then use whatever techniques you need to solve it, and not to be frightened to learn new methodologies. And so, I mean, it all worked out in 1994 when we solved this high resolution structure. Then it became, when I looked at it, it became clear that it was very important, because one could interpret the catalytic cycle in a way that we could not really have hoped to have been able to do. So we could relate the structural information. So these were single snapshots, really, taken by X-ray crystallography, that we could work out from them a great deal of information that linked to work that had been done by Paul Boyer, which related to the way in which ATP was being made. And from this, it was inescapable that the enzyme was driven by a rotary mechanical mechanism, which was something really quite new. So I've not explained the background. So the issue with Mitchell was, how was the proton motive force linked to the generation of ATP, a chemical synthesis? And Mitchell's view was that the protons went across the membrane, the inner membrane of the mitochondrion, and they participated directly in the catalytic site of the enzyme in phosphorus chemistry to produce ATP. So this he called direct or chemical coupling. And another chemist at Oxford called R.J.P. Williams had similar views. And the catalytic site is a long way from the membrane, and so you have to transport protons through a proton wire, which would be 150 angstroms through an aqueous space, which seemed pretty unlikely to me. And so the alternative view was called indirect coupling, but Mitchell was dead against indirect coupling right up to his death. He was much more he was strongly in favour of this idea of direct coupling, as he called it. Anyway, it turned out that it was indirectly mechanically coupled, and that was a new concept in enzymology, of a rotary action produced by consumption of what is really possible, which is electrical energy, the proton motive force being used to generate rotation, rather like water flowing through a dynamo generates electricity. It's a rather similar kind of action, actually. And so that, I mean, this made a big splash, and it now turns out, what is it now, 15, not quite 15 years on, that this rotary principle is really quite widely dispersed in a way that hadn't been realized. And the machine that I was trying to ask a question about in 1974, that Francis interrupted me, actually belongs to the same family of rotary enzymes. And so I think that's been pretty fulfilling to see that happen. The motif comes back to when we were determining a lot of protein sequences, and we knew that some of the proteins bound ATP, and we wondered whether we could work out in this 500 amino acids which bits were involved. And so we started comparing sequences that we determined with enzymes that were known to bind ATP, and we found some similarities. At that stage, the mathematical methods for doing this kind of calculation were not very well developed. The best method was devised by, again, someone at the LMB called Andrew McLaughlin, and we used Andrew's method to do this. Today people would not find what we found at all surprising, but then there was extreme skepticism that what we found was of any significance whatever. And eventually we published a paper in the Ember Journal. Because of all this skepticism, I didn't want to get things wrong. There was a big tradition of not getting things wrong. But anyway, I decided to publish the paper. And actually the person who submitted it on my behalf said it was very interesting, but of course wrong. But one of the editors thought not, actually, and it's the only time an editor has rung me up to discuss a paper that I'd submitted, and said he was extremely interested in what I'd done. He thought it was highly significant. So there it lay for years, and I used to think, oh, you know, one day this thing's going to come out, and it did, and it turned out that we were correct, and it highly predictive properties, and if one finds these motifs, one can be pretty sure that they've got something to do with binding a purine nucleotide, which is very important in biochemistry. So I mean, I didn't call them. There were two motifs, A and B, and people now call them Walker A and Walker B motifs. So I've been
fame, immortality.
And actually, somebody came up to me at a recent conference and said, "You're not the Walker of the Walker motif, are you?" I said, "Yes." They said, "Oh, you're still alive."
Yes. I thought you were
so
dead.
I thought full circle, you know.
That's right. Well, another chemist who I interviewed, who had, I think he had a metal or ore named after him, a murigite. This is John.
Oh, this is John Myrick
Thomas.
Yes, right.
Do you know John?
Well, I met him particularly in recent years through the chemistry department and through his association with a biochemist friend of mine, Leslie Dutton, who was one of his PhD students, and then because of John's friendship and knowledge about Max Perutz, and so we certainly talked about Max together, and I remember some of the tributes that John made to Max around the time of his Max's death. So I have met him from time to time.
Very loquacious.
Very loquacious, yes.
With a lovely bass voice.
Described Max as being pellucid. His writing has been pellucid.
Yeah. But John talked, and this is something I would perhaps like to now, unless there's anything else we should say about the Nobel Prize or your work.
Whatever you want.
Well, John talked quite a bit about Cambridge as a place to do research.
Oh yes.
You mentioned the community, which gave you support. A number of scientists have said that they've been tempted to go to America, and of course Sydney did, and Francis did to a certain extent. Have you ever been tempted to go away?
Not really. I mean, the environment at the laboratory of molecular biology was and still is so stimulating, and of course one of the great attractions was having long-term support that one justified via quinquennial review every 5 years, and so effectively one didn't need to spend a lot of time writing grants, and that's hugely attractive to me. And although I enjoy the little teaching that I've done, of course it meant that one was free from any teaching responsibilities as well, and so we are full-time researchers in the Medical Research Council, so we are different from a university department in that respect.
When you say the little teaching, do you lecture? Have you lectured at all?
I have. I was always impressed that Sydney would give a course of lectures to undergraduates, and that Max did as well. And I went to Max's lectures early on, and so I decided that I'd like to give some on bioenergetics, and so I used to in Part 2 biochemistry. It was part of the core curriculum. We now evolved into an option, so we still do it actually. We give a 12. I just used to give, I think, 2 or 3 lectures myself, but now it's evolved into a course that involves several of my colleagues that have done. It's a 12 lecture course. I give a couple of lectures, the introductory lecture. And I find that a good thing to do from many points of view. It gives contact with the students. They know we're there out on the Adbrook site, and I enjoy that contact.
What about PhD students? Have you had
I've
any?
had a lot of PhD students over the years, and more students than postdocs, I think. And at the Dun we have 50 PhD students, and I take a lot of effort over them. I think it's very important for the success of the unit, because a lot of the research is done by students and we're dependent upon them. So I enjoy that interaction very, very much.
And then you, I don't know if you had a college attachment before you went to Sydney.
I didn't, but I had, strangely enough, taught at Sydney Sussex College, because a friend of mine in the biochemistry department, Peter Henderson, was a fellow of Sydney, and he went on sabbatical and asked me if I'd like to take over his teaching. And I think this would be the early 1990s, or perhaps late 1980s, and I thought about it, and I decided I would, because I thought it would be a very good opportunity for me to, as it were, relearn the subject, because I was conscious that having worked for 15 years or so in a research institute, I, as it were, knew more and more about less and less, and so I thought that I'd like to relearn the subject, and I found that extremely valuable. I think I did that for a couple of years. I taught first year students in the cells course in Sydney, thanks to Peter. That's the only time that I've done that kind of teaching.
Then you became, Gabriel Horn, I think, invited you to be a fellow of Sydney.
He did, yes.
In about 97, was it? Or?
It was Post Nobel Prize, immediately, pretty soon after Sydney. Gabriel invited me to become a fellow, and I became a fellow, I think, before I received the prize, so it was between the announcement and actually the award.
Do you enjoy Sydney?
Very, very much, actually. I knew that it was something that was missing from my life, having been an undergraduate and graduate student at Oxford, and having had a lot of friends in arts subjects. I was quite conscious that at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology I was spending most of my time with other scientists and having very little contact with people in other disciplines. So it was something that I welcomed, actually, and it's one of the aspects that I enjoy most about being a fellow at a college is meeting people from other disciplines and talking to them about what they do, and for them wanting to know what I do. I found the collegiate nature of Sydney Sussex extremely pleasant, actually.
What about your home? I mean, did your wife also go to Sydney sometimes? I mean, I think they'd probably be, because when Prill was there...
Yes, well, they were very good at looking after fellows' wives, and I think it was probably Gabriel who instigated an annual dinner with the master and wives and partners, which my wife joins in college activities as she's able to, and also enjoys it.
There are three more general questions I had. One was, you mentioned earlier on your enthusiasm for music. Does that still mean a lot to you, music?
It does, yes. I mean, I still enjoy singing, although I've but in recent years I've really not taken part in any singing activities other than the occasions when I go to church, but I always enjoy singing. I enjoy going to musical concerts. I listen to music constantly, more or less, when I'm not working.
What kind of music do you like?
I've got a fairly wide taste, but the usual suspects. I guess I was sitting listening to some Beethoven, Schubert. I was listening to some Bach. I enjoy that. I enjoy opera. So I've had a lot of associations over the years with Italian universities, and I decided it was actually George Rada, who was the chief executive of the Medical Research Council, put me up to this. He said, when I go and give lectures in Italy and in Europe, I don't ask for a fee, but I insist that they take me to the opera. So I got onto that idea immediately, and so I love the opera, particularly Italian opera.
Radda is spelled R-A...
R-A-D-D-A.
Right.
Yeah. But I also enjoy other forms of music. I as an undergraduate, I was interested in folk music and did Morris dancing and folk singing. Became squire of Oxford University, Morris dancers and all this sort of stuff. And then I enjoy composers who then like Vaughan Williams and Holst who've used folk music themes in their works. So and then my wife has always been very keen on traditional jazz, and that certainly brushed off on me as well. So fairly wide taste.
The second question, you mentioned the Vietnam War and some ancestor who was conservative. Have you been politically involved much, or have any strong political associations?
I belonged to the Labour Club when I was an undergraduate. No, I can't say that I've had strong political formal associations. I've always felt that I was, as it were, too busy to get involved, or too committed to other things to get too involved in that. I mean, I think if I have sympathies, they would lie closer to the left than to the right. Well, no question about that. So, pretty much in favour of broadening access to Oxford and Cambridge to state education. It's an issue that concerns me very much, in the sense that I've often wondered whether somebody from my background would find it more or less easy to make it to Oxford and Cambridge than I did in 1960, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to that. So I mean, issues like that do concern me.
And we also, you mentioned an early association with chapels and the Church of England.
Yes, well, I mean, like most people who become interested in science, I think inevitably there becomes a conflict in your mind between the religion or the Christianity that you've been brought up with and part of you, and the logic of science, and that has to be resolved. And so perhaps took me slightly longer than some people to resolve it, but I came under fire. I tried to protect my position as a believing Christian as an undergraduate, and came under fire from people who really made me think about it, from the students that I knew, and eventually I decided that they really were incompatible, and so I, as it were, lost my religion, and that's still my current position. But having said that, actually it's something I have discussed with Gabriel. I still enjoy going to chapel and taking part in the service. Of course, one isn't participating properly in what is going on, but it's rather like participating in a kind of ritual, which I feel is part of me, actually, and I can't resolve. And actually I've decided I don't want to resolve it. So I've never met Richard Dawkins, but he would, I think he'd give me pretty short shrift for retaining those views, but I do feel it's just part of my makeup, and I don't want to get rid of it. I get some kind of enjoyment. Enjoyment is not the right kind of word. It's not some kind of vicarious enjoyment. It's actually it is spiritual in a way that I can't fully explain. And so I make no apologies at all for from time to time going to chapel in Sydney. And we actually have very fine music now in Sydney. We appointed a new music director last year who was extremely successful and has raised the standard of music to a very, very high level.
What about reading? Do you read poetry or novels, or?
I read novels. I read quite a lot of biography, actually. I'm sort of perhaps it's part of getting older. I'm interested in how discoveries were made and who did what. So I read recently a biography of Fred Hoyle that I happened to spot, which turned out to be really interesting. I read another one, biography of Lord Kelvin, recently. So I'm interested in the history of science, and I'm interested in history in general. I feel I don't know as much as I would like to about when things happened, and I've been reading about the Stuarts recently because that wasn't part of the history that I learned in school. My history started in 1714 and went till 1918, so I know quite a bit of that, but I never quite understood the Tudors and the Stuarts, so I've been reading some of that recently. I'm still very much imbued with this idea that comes from my mother that you should be improving yourself all the time. Of course, all academics feel that way, that we want to go on broadening ourselves and learning about things, but I do feel that quite strongly, that I don't want to waste my time. I want to learn about things that I didn't know about. I'm trying to learn Italian at the moment to improve my ability to listen to Italian opera. And, so I think I do read quite widely.
Well, all these interests, you've got many interests. We're at the same age, a few months apart, and I'm retiring in 2009. I'm not sure whether you'll reach 67.
I have reached 67 just last week. I have a contract that runs till I'm 68, and just what will happen after that isn't clear. I'm in discussions with various bodies, but my intention is not to retire. As long as I'm physically able, I would like to continue certainly longer in something which is close to laboratory science. I think that's what I do best. Over the past 10 years I've had to assume an administrative role, and I have enjoyed building up the Dun and getting people there and bringing along younger people. But I'm quite interested in continuing my own research. I've managed to keep it going during this period, and I would like to continue doing that. I think I'm still reasonably productive, and I feel there's a bit more in me yet, and I'm not ready to go out to grass yet.
As the joke says, retirement is for younger people. A question I often ask at the end of these interviews is, if you were giving advice to a young scientist who was just starting out, I asked Martin Rees this, I think, is there any particular thing you would stress to them? Many have said that it's very difficult times to start out in science now, but
it is, because so many other careers appear attractive, and it's another thing that worries me is that many of the best minds are just not attracted by science anymore for financial reasons. They see themselves having a better life by doing something else. But for somebody who is committed, I think if you're going to be successful, at least in research in science, it's very, very important to find the right topic to work on. And now, exactly how you do that, I think, is difficult, and it's much more difficult than it was 20 years ago, because fields of science are the ones that I work in are much more heavily occupied, and so finding your niche is actually quite difficult. So I think thinking carefully about the area in which you work, and then committing yourself to that area is very important. I think I would undoubtedly want to work in some aspect of neurobiology today. There are so many unknowns there that I think one really could make a niche, an important niche, and make real contributions in that area. So I think that's one piece of advice I give.
Not to go west, young man, but go to neurobiology, young man, or lady. Anyway, thank you very much indeed, John.
That's my pleasure. What did Martin say?
I had to look at the interview. It was something about, it was, again, something probably to do with finding good problems
Right.
to study, and commitment, and I'm going to collect together all the different
Bits of advice.
and see,
I've not been asked that one before. You know, I mean, one gets used to answering
Mhm.
the same questions. You know, what impacts the Nobel Prize, how would you like, all this sort of stuff. So one has that a little bit off pat. But that one I've not been asked before.
sense of humour sounds as if it might be useful as well.
I think so. Yes.
Anyway, thank you very much
No, it's
indeed,
fine.
John.